Good morning, everyone. Welcome along to another edition on The Whistle, where Sunderland fans, if you can stomach it, I'm afraid we're going to have another slightly longer chat about Coventry City 3, Sunderland 0. Very obviously, I think Sunderland's sort of worst performance of the season, certainly their worst result of the season. Spoke to Regis Lebris in his post-match press conference, and he sort of made the comparison to the Preston away game earlier in the season, which you might remember, in which he made a lot of changes. It's basically the only other game he could think of when Sunderland were so poor really and so not at the races. Obviously that day he'd made quite a lot of changes, there was a lot of rotation, and that was sort of a little bit of a mitigating factor, but certainly at this stage of the season to produce a poor performance, really concerning. And obviously some of you might have watched our Mind James's instant reaction video from the press box. You can go back and watch that if you haven't, in which we gave our immediate thoughts, and having slept on it and reflected on the game a little bit more, not too much has changed in my thoughts. A lot of credit has to go to Coventry for the sheer quality and speed with which they played. Sunderland just looked completely exhausted. I think you do question sort of the level of application that they put into the game, just because they lost so many duels, so many second balls. Their approach to the game did seem so passive, which is not something that we're used to seeing. Even when they sit off the game a little bit and play on the break, there's usually an aggression and an intensity about them that just wasn't there yesterday. So really concerning in that sense. It's really interesting speaking to Frank Lampard in his post-match press conference after the game, speaking about how his team did it. And what I thought was interesting about that was, I guess that, we know that Sunderland have a lot of quality in midfield, in the wide areas. And what we see in the season is there's basically kind of two ways you can play against that. You can either sit off the game, try and frustrate them, try and not give them too much space to play in, try and sit in your own box and defend and make it difficult. We've seen that work at times. Or you can go the other way and be really aggressive, try and apply some pressure on those midfielders, those wingers, try and get up the pitch, try and play out from the back, keep the ball away from Sunderland. We've seen that sometimes when teams have done that to Sunderland, the latter option, when they've played out from the back, they've really invited Sunderland's press and they've been picked off. And I guess my first thought was really, you have to give a lot of credit to Coventry for taking that slightly braver approach, but doing it so well, having the quality to execute, having the quality to play out from the back. I thought Matt Grimes and Jamie Allen were exceptional. I thought Matt Grimes, must be one of the best January signings in the division, really, to pick up a player of that quality and championship experience and calibre. I think you can see the impact he's had on Coventry. So I think that you, first of all, have to give Coventry a lot of credit. But the other thing that struck me was when Frank Lampard was talking about how Coventry approached the game, so much of their game plan, which they executed brilliantly, was to apply pressure on Sunderland's players when they got the ball, to not give them time and space. And it just struck me that actually that's something that at times this season Sunderland's players have been really good at dealing with. It's not necessarily a problem most of the time for Dan Neil, Joe Bellingham, Chris Rigg, Patrick Roberts, Romain Mundle. It's not usually a problem for these players to receive the ball under pressure in tight spaces. They're usually incredibly effective at breaking that, turning, and being really precise in their passing to open up the counter-attacking opportunity. And I think you could see today that, yesterday, that for whatever reason, whether it's mental or physical in terms of the tiredness or whatever, they just weren't able to cope with that on the day. So I think it's one of those where it's twofold, where you have to give credit to Coventry for the fact that they're clearly just in an excellent place, and obviously we know they've got really good individual talent. Hadji Wright coming back into the team after his recent injury, his first start, he'd made a couple of sub appearances, but to be able to put a player of that talent in the team, and the quality of his finishing, obviously really impressive. So Sunderland just outplayed and outfought really. And I think that is definitely a concern. And Lebris was speaking afterwards, making, sort of what we've all been talking about, really, kind of acknowledging that Leeds defeat had a really big impact on Sunderland, and that it put them in this position where, the top two looked really difficult. And yet the playoffs seemed almost certain. And so I think you can see that the players, I think there's an understandable difference in the teams yesterday, and that Coventry City, every point is absolutely vital for them. Even accounting for their brilliant form, they're still in quite a perilous position. Bristol City only 2 points behind them in 7th. And I think there was an obvious thing about the game yesterday, that for one team the stakes were incredibly high, and for one team the stakes just weren't quite so high. But I think obviously there's a requirement and an expectation when you pull on the Sunderland shirt about the level that you have to reach regardless of the game situation. And Sunderland fell well short of that yesterday, and it was an awful trip for the, again, despite there not being too much on the game, a sold out away end, huge number of followers making the pretty long journey from Sunderland. And what Sunderland just served up yesterday, wasn't good enough. So I'm hoping that can be a little bit of a wake-up call, some smelling salts for Sunderland in terms of, they have to realise what can happen at this division if they do try and coast. And obviously the big challenge for Lebris is how he gets that momentum back, how he gets that feel-good factor back, how he gets that sharpness back. There's still time. Sunderland have 8 games after the international break, so there's still time to rebuild some momentum and some confidence. But that's obviously Lebris' main task, and I think the first thing for him is how he gets the freshness back, because I think you can see that there's fatigue and there's a bit of staleness about the team at the moment, and that all sort of came home to roost yesterday against probably about the worst opponent Sunderland could have faced on the day. So let's have a look at your comments and questions. A lot of them along a similar theme, so we'll chat about them now. So the first one here from Andrea: how do we get the momentum back? Which is something that I was kind of thinking about, because it's obviously we talked a little bit about in recent weeks about how this is a unique situation really, with Sunderland pretty much knowing their fate so far out from the season. It's quite common for a team to know they're going to be in the playoffs from 3 or 4 games out, and then you sort of have that debate about, do you rest and rotate? Do you try and just attack it with your best team to build some momentum? To be so far out and be having this conversation is quite unusual for Sunderland. And in some ways, I think that's a bit of a positive. In response to your question, Andrea, I think there is time to regain that momentum. I think there is still time to do what you need to do in terms of freshening the team up, and still have 3 or 4 games at the end where you can really attack it with your inverted commas best team. I think that clearly, the main thing is going to be some recovery time. I think it's blatantly obvious that a lot of players in this team need a break. And so the international break's coming at a really important time for that. The concern with that is that a lot of players are going away on international duty. So you don't know how much rest these players are going to have. It's something I spoke about at the pre-match press conference with Lebris, and he said, we have built really good relationships with these national teams, especially with the youth teams, in terms of how we manage the minutes of these players, and he's hopeful that's something that will kind of continue to bear fruit, and that these players will be looked after and they won't be sort of overplayed during the international break. So yeah, I think rest and recovery is the most important thing, and the one positive is players like Dan Neil, Patrick Roberts, Luke O'Nien, Wilson Isidore, these players are going to get a proper break now, which could be really, really important. Like, it's obvious, on these videos, this especially earlier in the season when Daniel was getting a bit of criticism, really defended him and then had a brilliant run of form. It's very rare for Daniel to come off 10 minutes into the second half. That tells you that he's just not at the level we know he's capable of. And I think, I'm quietly hopeful that a couple of weeks rest will make the difference for him. I think with some of the younger players going away on international duty, that's obviously a bit more of a concern, because you don't know what level of rest they're going to get. Tricky one, that, because obviously the opportunity to go and play for your country is the absolute highest honour in football, so it's not an easy one for someone to manage. I think the other thing, Andrea, that I would say is that a couple of players back is going to make a big difference. I think the one positive that I'm clutching to, and hopefully I'm not being overly optimistic, is that Enzo Lefebvre, if he's not back for the Millwall game after the international break, he should definitely be back for the West Brom game. I'm hoping that will have a massive impact. I think especially with Mundell and Watson, who again, they're going to have a couple of weeks more training now, which will hopefully benefit them. The opportunity to drop Lefebvre into midfield, which is, I think, is a position where Sunderland are really struggling for energy at the moment, with the quality he's got, his willingness to take the ball, his ability to make things happen, the impact that'll have on everyone really in terms of lifting the mood. I'm hopeful will make a difference. That's kind of the one positive I'm taking away from the game. So that's definitely something that I hope will make a difference after the international break. And I think the other thing is to try and increase the pool of players really. I thought it was really I thought Alan Brown would start yesterday. I thought that against Cardiff, he had an excellent first half before tiring, which was understandable because he hadn't played much football. So really surprised he hasn't started one of the last 2 games. I really thought he would come on at half-time yesterday, or at least in the first set of subs. Because to me, I just think his sort of bite and his energy and championship experience, it looks like what Sunderland are crying out for a little bit in midfield. So I was really surprised that he didn't come on until much later in the game. And then when he did, he came on the right wing. I thought that was strange, to be honest. I think he's a player who thinks Sunderland needs some new energy. They need someone who's really sort of got something to prove and really eager to get on the pitch and make things happen. Lefebvre will do that naturally. Brown, someone else is that I think Sunderland surely have to look at using a little bit more after the international break to try and just increase that energy, if you like, in midfield. So yeah, hopefully I've answered that a little bit. I think there are some sort of there should be some positives on the horizon in terms of the rest that players are getting and some players coming back from injury, but especially with injury on the field, so we've said that all season. So we'll have to see how that develops. Quite a few of you asking a point on around this one. Chris says, will we always drop off towards the end of the season if we maintain such a youthful squad? And Louis says, we always seem to have a big dip in February, March, consequence of small squad numbers and young players. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is a pattern here. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Obviously, last season, there were some kind of exceptional circumstances in some of the off-pitch stuff that was going on. Obviously, the changes in manager, that had a huge impact on Sunderland around this time of year. But it's definitely a pattern. And we're seeing a lot of the time, this is the part of the season when young players, especially the ones who are in their first kind of professional season or the second professional season, have a big dip, and it's definitely an issue. And it's something we spoke about at the time, that, you know, Alex Neil's almost really ruthless management, if you like, when he came into the club, in acknowledging players who'd been overplayed, players who were tired, and development almost just completely went out the window. He focused on getting 11 players on the pitch who could get the team promoted. And I suppose that poses a really interesting question moving forward, and whether Sunderland can get promoted without that kind of attitude towards the end of the season. I think you have to put the other side of it forward as well, which is I've lost count of the number of managers who, through the first 30 games of the season, really praised the fact that Sunderland had such established patterns of play, that the players were so familiar, that they had this almost telepathic chemistry in certain areas of the pitch. And that only comes with using a small group of players who play together regularly. So I think the fact that Sunderland overachieved so much and was so much better than the Jason Pack through the first half of the season owed a lot to the familiarity that they had on the pitch. And I do also think that, generally speaking, where possible, it's better to have a smaller squad, because then everyone feels really involved. Everyone feels that they're really close to being involved. And I think you get a better level of sort of dressing room chemistry and a better level of training as a result of that. So it is a fine balance, and sometimes you do wonder if Sunderland are slightly too far in terms of the experience and the size of the squad the other way. I think the big thing for me this season is, I think having a small core of the squad, I think can potentially be a positive. I've outlined why earlier. I think the big thing for us is we just haven't had those players to come in and bolster it. So, you know, obviously Salis Abdul Samed is someone we thought could have a really beneficial impact on that midfield. It just hasn't been able to happen. Obviously Dan Ballard's injury issues, Adji Lise's injury issues. But I think if you look at someone like Jan Paveda as well, I think Barry Roberts has had a really good season, but I think you've seen the consequences of him just not having anyone to take the load off him, because obviously the Jan Paveda signing so far just hasn't worked out. And then again, you look at January, Jayden Dan's, hard to be too critical when, you find a back injury that he wasn't experiencing any symptoms of in his medical. But again, I think that's an example where I think a small squad and a young squad is okay, but you definitely towards the second half of the season, we were all saying that we're going to need these players to come in and have an impact. And that just hasn't materialised. And I think that's had a massive impact on why things have gone in the last couple of weeks they have for Sunderland. And the concern is that going to change towards the end of the season? We don't really know. Lefay is going to come back, and as I said, I think that's going to be a huge moment in Sunderland's season. I think that could give the whole place a real lift. Samed, I think, still a couple of weeks away after the international break. Again, will he be able to build his match sharpness before the end of the season? You don't know. Dan Ballard hopefully will be able to come back and have an impact if he can stay fit, which would be massive. But again, there's some uncertainty there. Jayden Dans, Jan Paveda, Ahmed Abdullahi, are these guys going to be able to play any real part in the season? We just don't know. So I think there is a definite concern there just in terms of the squad depth. And I do agree that this is a consequence. We've seen the benefits of the way Sunderland do things at the moment. We're seeing the negative. Our hope is always that you get a few players to sort of come in and bolster that towards the end of the season. But that hasn't just quite happened. And so that's definitely a concern. So I totally agree with that point. Safa Makim says, painful watch. We look drained and totally lacking ideas. Do you think our place in the playoffs could be at risk? I don't think so. I think Sunderland are going to be fine. I don't want to be too complacent about it given the level of performance yesterday, but I think, certainly at home, I still think Sunderland will accrue points. As I say, I think the return of Lefay is going to be really important. We know he's a match winner. I think that, one point that Brees made after the game, he didn't attempt to sort of hide how poor Sunderland had been in any way, shape or form. But what he did say was that, over the course of the season, certainly the lack of intensity in application is something that we haven't seen very often. And I do think you'll see a reaction after the break from these players. I think this defeat will sting them. Their attitude all season's been pretty much spot on. So I am concerned, as I've discussed at length, about some of the sort of issues in the squad, the fatigue especially. I do think there's some worries here, but I do expect a reaction after the break, and I certainly think they'll pick up enough points to cement their place in the playoffs. So yeah, that's definitely. I think we'll be okay on the playoffs, but the big question is what kind of stake can we get the squad in for then? Let's see what other questions we have. Bear with me. Anthony says, what happened? Worrying as we could face Coventry in the playoffs. Yeah, I think obviously talked through the game an awful lot. I think one of the interesting things that I was going to talk about, which this question's jogged my memory, thank you for that, was that, both managers were asked actually whether they felt this could have a psychological impact at the end of the season if the two teams do face each other in the playoffs. And I thought that, both managers were completely dismissive of that, especially Frank Lampard, who was sort of making the point that his team were by no means guaranteed to get in the playoffs anyway. But, he also did make the point that there's so much football to be played between now and the end of the season. It's not very long away, but there's actually quite a lot of games to be played. And I think the thing is in Coventry in a perfect spot at the moment, Sunderland in a pretty bad spot at the moment. But there's so much that can happen between now and then in terms of injuries, form, fatigue, that you just don't know. And listen, it might still be a benefit for Sunderland that they have this opportunity in the weeks ahead if they use it properly to rest and rotate a little bit. Other teams around them aren't going to have the opportunity to do that because of the position they're in the table. They're going to have to play their best team every single week. They're not going to be able to rotate. They're not going to be able to rest. And who knows, maybe in a month's time, some of those players will start to feel a little bit tired and Sunderland will be a little bit fresher. I think that's one positive we can possibly take forward, is that, Sunderland is still in a decent spot in the table. And if they get it right in the last month, there is still time and an opportunity to be in a good spot heading into the playoffs. But clearly they're going to have to play a hell of a lot better than they did here. So I'm going to finish with this one. Pato says, is it time to panic? Seems playing the same midfield for most of the season has taken its toll. Well, I agree with that latter point. I definitely think it's an area of the pitch where I spoke about this with Fabrice after the game. And to be fair to him, he was right. He said it wasn't just midfield. We looked tired pretty much all over the pitch. And he was right about that. But I do think it's such an important part of how Sunderland play. And I think the level has dipped so far from where it was at the start of the season that I definitely think there needs to be some rotation and towards the end of the season and some changes. I think Lefebvre is obviously going to do that naturally, which is a positive. But as I said, one big thing for me going forward is getting Alan Brown involved more. I can understand they want to be patient with Milan Alexic, who obviously still his first season in Sunderland. It's a high pressure scenario. They want to introduce him when he's right and when he's ready. So I can understand that a bit more, although I would like to see him come off the bench because I think he's got some pace and he can make something happen. But I think Alan Brown, for me, it's hard to justify why he's not playing more when you look at his experience at that level. So that's definitely one thing I'd be looking at. It's not time to panic. Like, Sunderland are in a good spot. If at the start of the season you'd said would be pretty much nailed on for the playoffs in the March international break, you'd have been happy with that. I should completely share what everyone has about making sure you've got some momentum and some positivity going into the playoffs. Sunderland, this performance was nowhere near good enough and they have to get a lot better if they're going to compete. But I would say that I don't think it's quite time to panic yet, because if the squad is managed properly between now and the end of the season, there's still a chance to go into that playoff campaign with a little bit of freshness and hopefully with players ready to sort of really go. And maybe, there's still a chance that you could have an advantage over teams who are going to have to go pretty much 100% between now and the end of the season. So definitely a hell of a lot of concern for sure about this level of performance, and probably, if we're honest about how the team has been performing over the last kind of pretty much since that Leeds game that Fabrice mentioned. But I'm hopeful that there'll be a reaction after the international break, and I'll leave you with one positive. Enzo is nearly back. So I don't want to, I think it's only right that it's been a pretty negative video after what happened yesterday, but Enzo will be back, and who knows, maybe that'll make a difference. So as ever, thanks so much for sending your questions in. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Really enjoyed doing these videos, and really appreciate all your support. So thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.